Books! Bibliolepsy is a 1997 novel written by Gina Apostol. It follows Primi Peregrino, and we follow her life from childhood as a little girl in Tacloban as the daughter of a taxidermist and an animator, and we follow her up until her adulthood as a student in UP Diliman during the 1986 EDSA revolution. Throughout her whole life, which is contained within the administration of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., we see her gain an undying craving, an undying passion for books, sex, and as the country with her as well, revolution. The titular bibliolepsy is a made-up word, a phenomenon, an illness that the first line of the book describes as a mawkishness derived from habitual aloneness and congenital desire. Its symptoms include a quickening between the thighs and in the points of the breasts, a broad aching when addressed by writers, books, bibliographies, dictionaries, and Xerox machines, a sympathy for typists of manuscripts, and is occasionally accompanied by a liking for rock and roll. Biblioleptic attacks are usually followed by bouts of complete distaste for words. An addiction to reading in all the best ways, and as you heard, a sort of kind of sexual addiction to reading. This is, in all intents and purposes, a 200-page, very horny passion for reading, and I think this book came to me at the most perfect time it could have possibly come. The biggest reason why I find Bibliolepsy to be so relatable is the main character herself, Primi Peregrino, who is heavily, basically, just a self-insert of Gina Apostol, the author, a la Jose Rizal. And Rizal himself is mentioned a handful of times in the book, and the book calls him a bibliolept himself, someone who is suffering from bibliolepsy. And I find it quite endearing because the way Primi, and I assume by extension Gina, talks about Rizal is first by bemoaning his omnipresence in any conversation about Philippine literature and even in the education curriculum as a whole. But ultimately, her assessment of Rizal is in a favorable light that I think comes from a place of love and I guess a sharing of passion, a biblioleptic camaraderie, a shared passion of the written word that is indicative of bibliolepsy. One of my favorite lines is that when she calls Jose Rizal as a bibliolept, she says na Jose Rizal a bibliolept himself, except that he cursed all of us by writing and not just reading. Gina Apostol is the most obvious mirror of Primi Peregrino, but as I read on and on with this book and I see Primi becomes such a cynical, pretentious, literary snob who's obsessed with sex and is so politically charged, I just can't help but be reminded of myself. But in all the three passions on books, sex, and literature, the language used is very much sexual encoded. Like, I call this book a book about how everything is sex, except sex itself, which is about literature. Because the way the book describes such an undying passion for literature and revolution is through the language of sex. The last few chapters of this book completely takes place during the 1986 EDSA revolution, and on multiple times, I can count on like 2 fingers the amount of times this book describes the EDSA revolution and EDSA Avenue itself as being clitoral, as being an orgy, as being orgasmic, as being the thighs of Metro Manila that are being stimulated. I have a list here. Throughout this book, letters are described as having bumps and crotches and breasts. Cupping the breasts of a woman is described as signing a signature. Poetry is clitoral and orgasmic. There it is again. And then sex itself is described as government. Oral sex is described as colonization and discovery. Sex is described as cartography, and sex is described as revolution. So literature is sex, sex is literature, revolution is sex, sex is revolution. Everything is sex in this book. The passion for all three, for books, sex obviously, and revolution, is described through the language of sex. That is how deep and guttural and passionate and primal bibliolepsy is. This is not merely just you're not just a fan of writing. It has to be something more primal, something more instinctual, a sexual love and passion for reading. Those three things that Preemie craves that I mentioned in the beginning, sex, books, and revolution, are very much intertwined in this book. Each of them are all over the book, but you can very neatly divide the book into three sections where either books, sex, or revolution are the dominating theme. But again, either in all three instances, the language and the way Preemie tackles it in her world is very much a straight line. Like it says, there's a straight line connecting books, sex, and revolution in Bibliolepsy. And for the most part, the language holds up. This is a very beautifully written, a very poetic book. But there was one passage in this book that describes Bibliolepsy, obviously this passion for reading, and by association, she admonishes writing. She says that it's nothing but an obstacle to reading. Why write when you can read and read and read? There's so much to read. And I find that to be quite amusing, because one of my main problems in this book is that it's overwritten. If anything, Gina Apostol shows too much of a love for writing, because I feel like the diction here, the choices of words, kind of get a life of their own, and sometimes they get lost in the sauce. Which I find very weird, because after Bibliolepsy was published, Gina Apostol took 13 years to write her next novel. And so you would assume that that means, oh, because she has Bibliolepsy, she's much rather more preoccupied with reading and writing. But as I read some of these words and some of these run-on sentences and lack of Oxford commas, I can't help but get an overwhelming sense that she loves writing to a fault just as much as she loves reading. Preemie's trifecta of passions of literature, sex, and revolution all have another side to the coin. They all are imbued with a certain profound sadness. Her love for books is an escape from some repressed trauma. Her love for literature is overcast by the looming shadow of history, and she speaks with a sort of hindsight and cynicism because of this. And though she has a passion for sex that is very much evident everywhere in this book, the way she describes sex herself and the many men she has these sexual encounters with is by no means pleasurable in many ways. They are far from romantic. That is never part of the question, but the language she uses in describing these men and describing these adventures with these men don't even seem to be, it doesn't even seem like she's into them. So no matter how visceral some of these passions are, they are all they are all sort of undermined by this hidden melancholy. Even though this is such an electric book, it jumps out at me at multiple times. It speaks at it speaks as if it's thinking at 1,000 miles per hour, and runs its mouth off so many times, and makes all these references and uses a thesaurus so many times. And even though this book is so alive in that way, I at the end of the day, after turning that last page, I am left with a picture of Preemie Peregrina as rather hollow. She feels human, but she feels hollow in the way that humans do, not in the way that badly written literary characters do. She feels empty. So yes, Bibliolepsy, I rated an 8 out of 10. I hope you like my yapping. Sex. Everything is sex, except sex, which is literature. and also revolution is sex, and everything is sex, and sex, but it's also sad. Sex can be sad. Bibliolepsy.